The house was quiet, almost eerily so. Katherine sat by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a worn photograph. John was in it, smiling, healthy, a picture of vitality from a time that seemed so distant now. John lay in bed, his frame barely making an impression on the mattress. His skin was pale, stretched too thin over bones that were once strong and capable. His eyes, however, still held the same warmth, the same depth that had captivated Katherine all those years ago. "Kat." John's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it still held a trace of the strength she remembered. "Come here for a moment." She moved to his side, forcing a smile onto her face. "What is it, Johnny?" He took her hand in his, the grip weak but steady. "I've been thinking. I want to be buried next to my parents. It would mean a lot to me." The request wasn't unexpected, but it still hit her like a punch to the gut. Arranging his burial meant accepting the inevitable, a future without him. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. "You've always been so strong," he continued, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I know you can do this." Katherine swallowed the lump in her throat and managed a small nod. "I'll take care of it." She left the house a few days later, the crisp autumn air biting at her cheeks as she made her way to the cemetery. The graves were neatly lined up, each one a silent testament to lives that had ended, stories that had concluded. The cemetery was serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Katherine's heart. She walked slowly along the paths, the soft rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant chirping of birds providing a soothing backdrop. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Katherine had always found cemeteries oddly comforting, a place where life's noise was replaced by a reflective silence. Today, though, the tranquility seemed almost mocking as she approached the caretaker's office to discuss John's burial plot. As she waited for the caretaker, her gaze wandered to a nearby section of the cemetery. There, sitting alone on the grass, was a young girl. Her hair was neatly braided, and she held a pastry in her small hands. Despite the peaceful setting, there was a palpable sadness in the girl's posture. Katherine felt a pang of empathy. She knew that kind of loneliness all too well. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the girl, who looked up as she approached. "Hi there," Katherine said gently. "Are you visiting someone?" The girl shook her head. "No, not really. My mum died recently and I just like it here. It's quiet." Katherine sat down beside her, careful not to disturb the flowers. "I'm sorry to hear about your mom. That must be really hard." The girl nodded, her eyes downcast. "I'm Molly. My aunt takes care of me now, but she's got her own kids to worry about. I heard her talking about sending me to an orphanage." The fear in Molly's voice was unmistakable. Katherine felt her heart clench. "That's a tough situation, Molly. How old are you?" 10, Molly replied, nibbling on her pastry. "I don't want to go to an orphanage. I don't want to leave my mum behind." Katherine reached into her bag and pulled out an apple, offering it to Molly. "Here, take this. I'm sure your aunt is just worried about how to take care of everyone. Sometimes adults say things when they're stressed that they don't really mean." Molly accepted the apple with a small smile. "Thank you. It's just hard, you know?" Katherine nodded. "I do. It can be really hard." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the cemetery filling the gaps between their words. Finally, Katherine stood up. "I have to go take care of some things, but it was nice talking to you, Molly." "You too," Molly said quietly. "Thank you for the apple." Katherine smiled and gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Take care, okay?" As she walked back to the caretaker's office, her thoughts lingered on the young girl. Molly's fear and vulnerability had touched something deep within her, stirring memories of her own childhood and the struggles she had faced. After finalizing the details for John's, Katherine drove home. The house was silent when she returned, the kind of silence that had become all too familiar. She found John asleep, his breathing shallow and labored. Sitting by his side, she reached for his hand, feeling the fragility of his bones beneath her fingers. "John," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I met a girl today. She's all alone, just like we are." He didn't stir, but she continued, needing to voice her thoughts. "She lost her mum, and now she might lose her home too. It's not fair. None of it is fair." The days blurred into each other as John's condition worsened. Katherine stayed by his side, her thoughts often drifting to Molly. She wondered how the girl was coping, whether she was still afraid of being sent away. The quiet hum of the camera was barely noticeable, tucked discreetly into the corner of John's bedroom. Katherine had installed it to monitor his health while she was at work, a small comfort in the growing chaos of their lives. Each day, she checked the footage, hoping for some sign of improvement. But each day, John seemed a little weaker, a little closer to the end. One afternoon, as she sifted through the recorded videos, she heard John's strained voice on the phone. She turned up the volume, her curiosity piqued. "I want to make sure Molly is taken care of," John said, his voice filled with a rare urgency. "Yes, the apartment should go to her." Katherine's heart skipped a beat. Molly. The name sounded familiar, but why was John talking about her? She listened intently, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. "No, it has to be quick," John continued. "I don't have much time left." Katherine's mind raced. Why was John so concerned about her? The thought of infidelity flashed through her mind, stirring a potent mix of anger and confusion. She needed answers, and she needed them now. That evening, as she prepared John's medication, she couldn't keep the turmoil inside any longer. "John," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I heard you talking about Molly. Who is she?" John looked up, his eyes tired but clear. "Kat, it's not what you think." "Then tell me," she demanded, unable to mask the edge in her voice. "I deserve to know." He sighed, taking a moment to gather his strength. "Molly is Dean's daughter. Dean was my best friend, you remember. When he was dying, he made me promise to take care of his family." Katherine's anger began to wane, replaced by a deepening confusion. "But why didn't you tell me?" "Dean didn't want his wife, Mary, to feel like a burden," John explained. "He asked me to keep it quiet, to help them without making it obvious." "And now?" Katherine asked, her voice softer. "What happened to Mary?" "Mary passed away a year ago," John said quietly. "Molly's been living with her Aunt Gina. They're struggling, Kat. Molly needs help." Katherine felt a pang of guilt for her earlier suspicions. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" "I didn't want to add to your burden," John replied, his eyes filled with regret. "But now I need you to understand. Molly's our responsibility." Katherine sat down beside him, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. "John," she said softly, taking his hand in hers, "we'll make sure she's taken care of. I promise." His grip tightened slightly, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Thank you, Kat. That means everything to me." The house was still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every creak and sigh. Katherine sat by John's bedside, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, each breath a struggle. The room was dim, the soft glow of a lamp casting gentle shadows. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the small, poignant scene unfolding within these walls. "Kat," John whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen machine. She leaned closer, taking his frail hand in hers. "I'm here, Johnny." His eyes, though clouded with pain, held a familiar warmth. "I need you to promise me something." Katherine's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. "Take care of Molly," he said, each word a labor. "She needs someone who can give her a chance." Tears welled up in Katherine's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I promise, John, I'll take care of her." A faint smile touched his lips. "Thank you. That means everything to me." As the night wore on, John's breaths grew shallower, each one more labored than the last. Katherine stayed by his side, her hand never leaving his. She watched as the life slowly ebbed from his body, the man she loved slipping away, and then, with a final, gentle sigh, he was gone. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing down on her. Katherine sat there, numb, the weight of her grief settling like a heavy cloak around her shoulders. She had known this moment was coming, but knowing did little to lessen the pain. She stood, moving on autopilot to close his eyes, her fingers trembling. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll keep my promise." The days following John's death were a blur of arrangements and condolences. Friends and family came and went, their words of comfort washing over her in a haze. Katherine moved through it all with a quiet resolve, her mind fixed on the promise she had made. Finally, the house was empty, and the quiet settled in once more. Katherine found herself at John's desk, sorting through papers. She found the details for the small apartment he had wanted to leave to Molly. It was time to fulfill her promise. Katherine sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun casting long shadows across the room. Her mind was made up. She would keep her promise to John and find Molly. She picked up the phone and dialed David's number. "David, it's Katherine," she said when he answered. "I need your help." "Of course, Kat. What's going on?" David's voice was steady, a comforting anchor in her sea of uncertainty. "It's about Molly. I need to find her and make sure she's okay." "John made me promise," she explained, her voice betraying a hint of the determination she felt. David was silent for a moment. "I have some information that might help. Can we meet up?" "Yes, please. The sooner, the better," Katherine replied. They agreed to meet at a small cafe in town. As Katherine walked through the door, she saw David already seated, a coffee cup in hand. He stood up and gave her a reassuring hug. "Katherine, I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "Thank you, David. I appreciate it," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "But right now, I need to focus on helping Molly." David nodded and pulled out a small notebook. "Gina, Molly's aunt, is doing her best, but they're struggling. Mary passed away last year and it's been tough on them." Katherine squeezed his hand, grateful for his support. "How do we find them?" "I've got their address," David said, passing her a piece of paper. "It's not far from here. We can go today if you're ready." "I am," Katherine said with determination. The drive to Gina's house was filled with a tense silence. The modest house stood at the end of a narrow street, its paint chipped and windows slightly fogged from years of weathering. Katherine and David walked up the path, the quiet of the neighborhood interrupted only by the distant sounds of children playing. As they reached the door, David knocked gently, and moments later, it opened to reveal Gina. "Hello," Gina greeted them, her voice weary but kind. "You must be Katherine and David." Yes, that's right, Katherine replied, offering a small smile. We've come to help. Gina stepped aside, ushering them into the small living room. It was simple but tidy, with worn furniture and toys neatly stacked in a corner. Thank you for coming. It's been hard, but we're managing. Just then, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. It was Molly, the same girl she had met at the cemetery. Molly's eyes widened in recognition. "You're the lady from the cemetery," Molly exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and joy. Katherine knelt down to her level, a smile breaking across her face. "Yes, Molly. We've come to make sure you're okay." Molly looked between Katherine and Gina, her eyes shimmering with hope. "Really? Really?" Katherine affirmed, her voice steady. "John made me promise to take care of you, and I always keep my promises." Gina watched the exchange with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Please sit down," she said, guiding them to the worn but comfortable sofa. "It's been a struggle since Mary passed. Molly's been through so much, but she's strong." As they settled into the small living room, the weight of Gina's words hung in the air. "We've been managing as best we can," Gina continued, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But it's been tough. Molly's a bright girl, but she needs more than I can give right now." Katherine nodded, her heart aching for the little family. "We're here to help, Gina. We'll make sure you're not alone in this." Molly climbed onto the sofa next to Katherine, her small hand reaching out to touch Katherine's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was so scared." Katherine squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone anymore, Molly. We're going to get through this together." David cleared his throat, breaking the emotional moment with a practical question. "What do you need most right now, Gina?" Gina sighed, glancing around the modest room. "Financial support would be a big help, and some repairs around the house. But mostly, Molly needs stability." Katherine looked at David, a silent agreement passing between them. "We can help with that," she said firmly. "We'll make sure Molly has what she needs." As they talked, plans began to take shape. Katherine would assist with financial support, ensuring that Molly had everything she needed for school and daily life. David offered to help with repairs around the house, making the home more comfortable for everyone. Later, as they left Gina's house, Katherine felt a sense of peace amidst her grief. She had lost John, but in keeping his promise, she found a new purpose. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it, driven by a sense of duty and the love that still lingered in every corner of their home. Driving back, Katherine glanced at David. "Thank you for helping me," she said softly. David smiled. "It's what friends are for, Kat. We'll get through this together." That night, as Katherine sat in the quiet of her bedroom, she whispered into the darkness, "I'll keep my promise, Johnny. I'll take care of Molly." The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Gina's modest home. Katherine stood in the small kitchen, unpacking groceries she had brought. Gina watched her with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "You really didn't have to do all this," Gina said, her voice heavy with exhaustion but tinged with gratitude. Katherine smiled gently, placing a loaf of bread on the counter. "I want to help, Gina. This is just the beginning." Gina nodded, her eyes glistening. "You have no idea how much this means to us." As the weeks passed, Katherine's visits became a regular part of their routine. She brought food, clothes, and other necessities, but more importantly, she brought a sense of hope and stability. Molly, initially shy and withdrawn, began to open up, little by little. One afternoon, as they sat in the small living room, Molly looked up from her drawing and spoke, her voice hesitant. "Katherine, do you think things will ever get better?" Katherine paused, considering her words carefully. "Yes, Molly. I believe they will. It might take time, but we'll get there." Molly's eyes, filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, met Katherine's. "I want to believe that." Katherine smiled, reaching out to touch Molly's hand. "You can believe it. We're in this together." Slowly, Molly began to share more about her life, her fears, and her dreams. Katherine listened, offering comfort and reassurance. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Katherine's home, Molly spoke in a small voice. "I'm scared, Katherine. I'm scared of being alone again." As the bond between them deepened, Katherine began to consider a more permanent solution. She knew Molly needed stability, a sense of security that went beyond the occasional visits and support. One evening, after a long day, she sat with Gina, discussing the future. "Gina," Katherine began, her voice careful, "I've been thinking about Molly's future. She needs stability, a permanent home." Gina looked at her, eyes wide with understanding. "You want to adopt her?" Katherine nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, I think it's what John would have wanted, and I think it's what's best for Molly." Gina's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "You'd be a wonderful mother to her. She needs someone like you." The decision made, they began the process of adoption. It was a slow and often frustrating journey, filled with paperwork and legal hurdles, but Katherine was determined. She knew it was the right thing to do. Through it all, Molly's trust in Katherine grew. She began to see Katherine not just as a helper or a friend, but as a true guardian, someone who would always be there for her. The process was long, but each step brought them closer to becoming a family. The loss of John was still a deep wound, but in caring for Molly, she found a new sense of purpose. She was no longer alone in her grief. She had found someone to share her journey with. Months passed, and the adoption was finally approved. On the day the papers were signed, they sat together, the weight of their journey lifting as a new chapter began. "Molly," Katherine said, her voice choked with emotion, "welcome home." Molly's smile was bright, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "Thank you, Katherine, for everything." Katherine hugged her tightly, whispering into her hair, "We're family now, and we'll face whatever comes next, together." In the quiet of their new beginning, surrounded by the warmth of their growing bond, they found a sense of peace and a promise of a brighter future. For the first time in a long time, both Katherine and Molly felt truly at home. The morning started like any other. The sky was a crisp, clear blue, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds chirping and children playing. Katherine was driving Molly to school, the car filled with the soft hum of the radio and Molly's chatter about her upcoming school project. They were in the middle of discussing ideas when it happened. The truck appeared out of nowhere. One moment, the road was clear, and the next, a massive, out-of-control truck was barreling towards them. Katherine's heart leapt into her throat as she swerved, trying to avoid the collision. The sound of screeching tires and the deafening crash filled the air as metal met metal. The impact was brutal. Katherine's head slammed against the steering wheel, and everything went dark. When she came to, the world was a blur of flashing lights, shouting voices, and unbearable pain. She could hear Molly crying, her voice a desperate, heart-wrenching sound that cut through the fog in Katherine's mind. "Molly," she tried to say, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper. She struggled to move, to reach out to her, but her body refused to cooperate. Strong hands pulled her from the wreckage, and she was strapped onto a stretcher. The paramedics worked quickly, their faces a mix of concentration and urgency. She tried to speak, to ask about Molly, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision blurred, and darkness claimed her again. She awoke in the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils. Her body ached, every movement a reminder of the crash. Her first thought was of Molly. Panic surged through her as she tried to sit up, only to be gently pushed back by a nurse. "Easy, Miss Katherine," the nurse said softly. "You need to rest." "Molly," Katherine croaked, her throat dry and voice hoarse. "Where's Molly?" The nurse's expression softened. "She's okay. She's with your friend David. He brought her here and has been waiting for you to wake up." Relief washed over Katherine, and she sank back into the pillows, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. David appeared shortly after, a worried but relieved look on his face. "Katherine, thank God you're awake." "How's Molly?" she asked urgently. "She's shaken up, but she's okay," David reassured her. "She's been asking for you." Katherine nodded, her heart aching with both relief and pain. "I need to see her." David squeezed her hand. "You will, as soon as the doctors say it's okay." Over the next few days, Katherine's recovery was slow and painful. She had suffered a concussion, several broken ribs, and a fractured leg. The physical pain was intense, but the emotional toll was even greater. The thought of what could have happened to Molly haunted her, keeping her awake at night. When she was finally able to see Molly, the reunion was filled with tears and hugs. Molly clung to her, her small body trembling with relief. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought I was going to lose you." Katherine held her close, her own tears falling freely. "I'm here, Molly. I'm not going anywhere." As she lay in the hospital bed, Katherine had a lot of time to think. The accident had been a harsh reminder of how fragile life was. It reinforced her determination to create a stable, loving home for Molly, a place where she would always feel safe and cared for. The road to recovery was long and arduous. Physical therapy sessions left her exhausted, and there were days when the pain and frustration threatened to overwhelm her. But through it all, Molly was her constant source of strength and motivation. One evening, as they sat together in the hospital room, Molly looked up at Katherine with a serious expression. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Katherine smiled, though her eyes were filled with tears. "And you saved mine, Molly. You've given me a reason to keep going." The bond between them grew stronger, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. They talked about the future, making plans and dreaming of the life they would build together once Katherine was fully recovered. When the day finally came for her to leave the hospital, they both felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. David drove them home, the journey filled with cautious optimism. As they walked through the front door, Molly turned to Katherine, her eyes shining with determination. "We're going to be okay, right?" Katherine smiled, her heart full. "Yes, Molly. We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be happy." In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds, they began to heal. The accident had left its mark, but it had also strengthened their resolve to face whatever challenges came their way, together. Katherine's home was filled with the warm glow of a late afternoon sun, casting soft shadows on the walls. She and Molly sat at the kitchen table, painting together. Molly's concentration was intense, her tongue peeking out between her lips as she carefully added color to her picture. Katherine watched her, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Do you like painting?" Katherine asked, her tone light. Molly nodded, not looking up. "It helps me think. It makes me happy." Katherine's smile widened. "I'm glad." We should do this more often." They spent many afternoons like this, the simple act of creating something together, strengthening their bond. Molly's walls began to come down, little by little, as she opened up more about her past and her hopes for the future. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Molly turned to Katherine, her eyes searching. "Katherine, do you miss him? John, I mean." Katherine sighed, looking out at the darkening sky. "Every day, Molly. He was a big part of my life. But having you here helps." Molly leaned her head against Katherine's shoulder. "I'm glad you found me." Katherine wrapped an arm around her, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Me too, Molly. Me too." The days turned into weeks, and Katherine found herself reflecting more on her own past. One afternoon, she decided to share her story with Gina. They sat in Gina's small living room, sipping tea. "Gina, there's something I need to tell you," Katherine began, her voice steady but soft. "I've never talked about this before, but I think it's time." Gina looked at her with concern. "Of course, Katherine. What is it?" Katherine took a deep breath. "Years ago, I went through something very traumatic. It changed my life completely. I never thought I'd be able to talk about it, let alone heal from it. But helping Molly, being a part of her life, it's helped me more than I can say." Gina reached out, taking Katherine's hand. "I'm so sorry you went through that. But I'm glad you're finding healing. Molly's lucky to have you." Katherine squeezed her hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Gina. It means a lot to me." As the legal process of adoption moved forward, both Katherine and Molly found themselves filled with a renewed sense of hope. Each step, each signed document, brought them closer to becoming a family. It was a slow and sometimes frustrating journey, but Katherine was determined. One day, they received the news they had been waiting for. The adoption was nearly finalized. Katherine and Molly celebrated quietly at home, the joy in their hearts a silent but powerful testament to their journey. "Katherine," Molly said as they sat together in the living room, "do you think we'll always be together?" Katherine looked at her, her eyes filled with love. "Yes, Molly, we're family now. We'll always be together." Molly smiled, her eyes bright with happiness. "I like that. I feel safe with you." Katherine hugged her tightly, feeling the last of her own fears melt away. "And I feel complete with you, Molly. You've brought so much joy into my life." Katherine's home became a place of laughter and love, a stark contrast to the quiet, grief-filled days that had once defined it. Molly thrived, her fears slowly giving way to a sense of security and happiness. One evening, as they walked through town, Molly looked up at Katherine. "Do you think we'll always be happy?" Katherine smiled, her heart full. "I think happiness is something we work on every day, and as long as we're together, I believe we'll find it." Molly nodded thoughtfully. "I like that. I want to be happy with you." Katherine squeezed her hand. "We will be, Molly. We will be." In the quiet moments of their everyday life, Katherine found her own wounds beginning to heal. The scars of her past, while still present, no longer defined her. She was moving forward, not just for herself, but for Molly. As the adoption process neared its conclusion, they sat together, the future stretching out before them. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and in each other they found the strength to face whatever came next. Katherine looked at her, her eyes shining. "No, Molly. Thank you for giving me a reason to heal, for giving me a reason to hope." And in that moment, as they sat together in the warm embrace of their home, they knew they had found something precious. They had found each other, and that was enough. The day was bright and clear as Katherine stood outside the courthouse clutching the adoption papers. Molly stood beside her, eyes wide with anticipation. The moment had finally arrived. Katherine was officially Molly's mother. Katherine looked down at Molly, her heart swelling with emotion. "Are you ready, Molly?" Molly nodded, her voice steady. "I'm ready." They walked hand in hand to the car, the weight of their journey lifting with each step. As they drove to the cemetery, the silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding and shared hope. At John's grave, they stood together, the gravestone a silent witness to their new beginning. Katherine knelt, placing a bouquet of fresh flowers at its base. "John," she whispered, her voice catching, "we did it. Molly is ours now." Molly stepped forward, her small hand resting on the stone. "Thank you, John, for everything." They stood in silence, the gentle breeze carrying the faint scent of flowers. It was a moment of closure, a way to honor the past while embracing the future. Later that day, they headed to Gina's home, a sense of anticipation in the air. Gina greeted them at the door, her face lit with a smile. Come in," she said, her voice warm. "I have news." They gathered in the small living room, the atmosphere filled with a quiet excitement. Gina took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "I received a call," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "They think they've found my husband. He's alive." Katherine and Molly gasped, their eyes wide with shock and joy. "Where is he?" Katherine asked, leaning forward. Gina's voice was thick with emotion. "He's in a hospital a few towns over. He doesn't remember much, but he's alive." Molly reached out, taking Gina's hand. "That's wonderful news, Aunt Gina." Gina nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It is. I never gave up hope." Katherine squeezed Gina's hand, her own eyes filled with tears. "We're here for you, whatever you need." The room was filled with a sense of unity, a shared understanding of the power of hope and love. They decided to celebrate together, the small home filled with laughter and the warmth of newfound family. As the evening drew on, Katherine and Molly sat together on the porch, the night air cool and refreshing. Molly looked up at Katherine, her eyes filled with a newfound confidence. "Do you think we'll always be this happy?" she asked softly. Katherine smiled, her heart full. "Happiness isn't always easy, Molly, but as long as we're together, we can face anything." Molly nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I like that. I like being with you." Katherine wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "And I love being with you, Molly. You've brought so much joy into my life." The stars began to twinkle above, each one a reminder of the countless possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in a long while, Katherine felt a sense of peace, knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. One afternoon, as they prepared for another family gathering, Molly looked up at Katherine, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Katherine, for everything." Katherine knelt down, looking into Molly's eyes. "No, Molly, thank you. You've given me a reason to hope again." Molly smiled, her heart brimming with happiness. "We're a family now." Katherine hugged her tightly, feeling the truth of those words deep in her soul. "Yes, we are, and we'll always be." The future stretched out before them, filled with challenges and joys yet to come. But with each other, they knew they could face anything. They stood together, a family forged by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of the heart. And in that moment, They knew they had found something truly precious: each other. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch our video. We hope these stories of kindness have not only warmed your heart, but also served as a powerful reminder of the goodness that still exists in the world. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, is a reflection of the love and compassion that God teaches us to share with one another. We believe that by sharing these stories, we can inspire others to look for opportunities to spread kindness in their own lives, thereby creating a ripple effect of goodness that touches countless souls. Let these stories remind us all of the power of faith and the importance of trusting in God's plan. May they inspire you to seek out the good in every situation and to be a beacon of light for others. As we go forward, let us commit to being vessels of God's love, spreading kindness wherever we go. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with us and to continue receiving uplifting content. Together, let's make the world a kinder, more compassionate place. Thank you, God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.